The morning 200 men in black suits bowed in silence outside a small, worn-down house. The entire neighborhood stopped breathing. But no one tells the story this way. A struggling single mother thought she had helped a stranger survive one rainy night. She had no idea she had just changed the balance of power in an entire city. At 7:12 a.m., Hannah Brooks stood barefoot on her narrow front porch, her fingers still wrapped around a chipped coffee mug that had gone cold minutes ago, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the low hum of engines idling along the curb. The street she had walked every day for years now looked completely different, lined with sleek black SUVs, stretching as far as she could see, their polished surfaces reflecting the pale morning light, like something out of a movie she would never have imagined being part of, and in front of them, arranged with precise, almost unsettling symmetry, stood rows of men dressed in dark suits, their posture rigid, their presence heavy, their attention fixed entirely on her modest home as if it were the most important place in the world. Hannah's first instinct was that something had gone terribly wrong, that somehow the fragile, quiet life she had fought so hard to maintain for herself and her young son had finally cracked under pressure. Because nothing about this felt normal, nothing about this felt safe, and yet none of the men moved toward her, none of them spoke, none of them even glanced at each other. And then, as if responding to an invisible signal, all at once, every single one of them lowered their heads in complete silence. The sound of fabric shifting and shoes adjusting against pavement was the only thing that broke the stillness. And it sent a chill down her spine because it wasn't chaos or aggression she was witnessing. It was something far more controlled, far more deliberate, something that felt like respect or worse, loyalty. Her breath caught as she instinctively stepped back toward the doorway, her mind racing through every possible explanation and rejecting each one just as quickly, because nothing in her life made sense of this moment. Not the overdue bills stacked on her kitchen counter, not the double shifts she worked just to keep the lights on, not the quiet promises she whispered to her son each night that things would get better. A neighbor's curtain twitched across the street. Someone else's door creaked open just a fraction, but no one dared step outside. No one dared interrupt whatever this was, and Hannah realized with a sinking feeling that whatever had brought these men here, it had everything to do with her. Her grip tightened around the mug until her knuckles turned pale, her thoughts flashing back to the night before, to the rain that had soaked through her jacket, to the moment she had almost walked past a stranger lying still in the shadows, to the split-second decision that had felt small at the time, but now echoed louder than anything else in her life. She swallowed hard, her voice barely more than a whisper as she stared at the sea of bowed heads. "What is this?" But deep down, before anyone answered, before any door opened or any truth was revealed, she felt it in the pit of her stomach that this moment wasn't random. It wasn't a mistake in whatever she had done the night before. Whatever choice she had made in the quiet darkness when no one was watching had set something enormous in motion, something that had now arrived at her doorstep, waiting, patient, and impossible to ignore. Hannah did not step forward, and she did not speak again, because the weight of the moment pressed against her chest in a way she had never felt before, as if the life she had been living up until now was quietly being replaced by something she did not yet understand. Just 24 hours earlier, this same street had been empty except for the occasional passing car and the distant hum of the city waking up. And her biggest concern had been whether she could stretch $87 to cover groceries for the rest of the week. The small house behind her, with its peeling paint and narrow hallway, had never been a place of importance. It had been a place of survival. A place where she counted every dollar, every hour, every bit of energy she had left after working back-to-back shifts at a diner and cleaning offices late into the night. And yet now, every pair of eyes in front of her was fixed on that very house, as if it held something valuable beyond measure. Her mind struggled to catch up, slipping back into the familiar rhythm of yesterday morning, when she had stood in the same kitchen tying her hair into a loose knot, glancing at the clock that always seemed to run faster when she needed it to slow down, her son still asleep in the next room, his small shoes by the door waiting for another day she hoped would be better than the last, She remembered opening the refrigerator and staring at its contents, calculating silently, deciding which meals she could skip so he would not have to, promising herself again that things would change even though she did not know how. There had been no black cars, no silent men, no sense that anything extraordinary was about to happen, just the quiet determination of a mother trying to hold everything together with very little. Even as she stood on the porch now, surrounded by something that felt unreal, part of her clung to that version of her life because it was the only thing that made sense, the only thing she knew how to manage. A faint breeze moved through the street, brushing against her face, and she realized her hands were trembling, not from fear alone, but from the sudden, overwhelming contrast between what her life had been and what was unfolding in front of her. Somewhere behind her, she heard a soft sound from inside the house, a small movement that reminded her why she had never allowed herself to take risks, why she had always chosen the safer path, the quieter choice, the one that kept her world predictable even if it kept her struggling. And that was what made this moment feel impossible, because nothing about this was safe, nothing about this was predictable, and yet it had been set in motion by a single decision she had made without thinking about consequences, without imagining that the stranger she had refused to leave behind could be connected to something this powerful, something this controlled. Her eyes moved slowly across the rows of men again, noticing the way they stood without shifting, without impatience, as if time itself did not apply to them, as if they would remain there for as long as it took. And that realization settled deep within her, bringing with it a quiet, undeniable truth that whatever was happening was not temporary. It was not a misunderstanding, and it was not going to disappear if she simply stepped back inside and closed the door, because this had already crossed into her life, and whether she was ready or not, everything was about to change. The memory came back to her in fragments, not all at once, but in pieces that slowly fit together like something she wished she could forget. The sound of rain tapping steadily against the pavement, the glow of a flickering streetlight, the exhaustion that had settled deep into her bones after another late shift that barely paid enough to matter. She had been walking home with her jacket pulled tight around her, counting the steps between corners the way she always did when she was too tired to think about anything else. When something unusual caught her attention near the edge of the sidewalk, a shape that did not belong, too still, too out of place to ignore. At first she had told herself to keep walking because that was what she always did, avoid trouble, avoid risk, protect the small, fragile world she had built for her son. But something about that moment refused to let her move on, something quiet but persistent that made her slow down, then stop completely. She remembered standing there for a few seconds that felt much longer, her mind racing through every possible consequence, every warning she had ever heard about getting involved in situations that were not hers, every reason to turn around and pretend she had seen nothing at all. And yet, despite all of that, she had taken a step closer, then another, until she could see clearly that it was a man lying there, his breathing shallow, his presence somehow both fragile and intense at the same time. She had knelt beside him, her hands unsure at first, her heart beating faster as she tried to figure out what to do, because calling for help felt like the obvious choice, but something held her back, something about the way he looked, the quiet authority, even in his stillness, the sense that involving the wrong people might make things worse instead of better. She had whispered to herself that she would only stay for a moment, just enough to make sure he was not alone, just enough to ease her conscience. But that moment had stretched into something more when he shifted slightly, when she realized he needed immediate help, when walking away stopped being an option she could live with. The rain had grown heavier, soaking through her sleeves as she struggled to support his weight, her shoes slipping slightly against the wet ground as she guided him toward her house just a few blocks away, every step filled with uncertainty, every second a question she could not answer. She remembered glancing over her shoulder more than once, half expecting someone to appear, someone to stop her, someone to tell her she was making a mistake. But no one came, and the streets remained empty except for the sound of rain and her own uneven breathing. By the time she reached her front door, her hands were shaking from effort and from something deeper, something she could not name, because she knew this was no longer a small decision. This was something that would follow her beyond that night. Something that had already begun to change the direction of her life in ways she could not yet see. Standing there now, facing the silent line of men outside her home, Hannah understood that the moment she chose not to walk away had not been random. It had been the beginning of everything that was now unfolding, and the most unsettling part was not the presence of those men or the weight of their attention. It was the realization that she had made that choice without knowing who he was, without knowing what world he belonged to, and without knowing that by helping him, she had stepped directly into that world herself. Inside the house, the memory sharpened into something more vivid, more immediate, as Hannah recalled the exact moment she had crossed the threshold with him. The door closing behind them with a quiet click that sounded far louder than it should have, sealing off the outside world and everything familiar with it. The small living room suddenly felt even smaller, the air heavier, as she carefully guided him toward the worn couch that had seen years of use, her movements cautious but determined, as if any hesitation now would undo everything she had already committed to. She had not allowed herself time to think about consequences. Not then, because there had only been one clear priority: to keep him conscious, to keep him breathing, to do whatever she could. With what little she had, she remembered grabbing a clean towel from the kitchen, her hands moving quickly despite the tremor that ran through them, her mind focusing on simple steps: pressure, warmth, steadiness, anything that might help, anything that might buy time. The man had barely spoken, but there had been moments when his eyes opened slightly, moments that unsettled her more than anything else, because even in that fragile state, there was a sharpness in his gaze, something controlled and aware, as if he was not just a stranger in need, but someone who was used to being in control of every situation. She had tried not to meet his eyes for too long, telling herself it did not matter who he was, that what mattered was what she was doing, but that quiet intensity stayed with her, lingering in the back of her mind as she worked. Time had stretched in a strange way that night, minutes blending together as the rain continued outside, tapping steadily against the windows, the only constant in a moment filled with uncertainty. At one point, she had glanced toward the hallway where her son slept, her chest tightening at the thought that she had brought something unknown into their home, something she did not fully understand. And for a brief second, doubt had surged through her, sharp and immediate, urging her to stop, to reconsider, to call someone and step away from the situation entirely. But then she had looked back at him, at the faint rise and fall of his breathing, at the undeniable reality that leaving him alone was no longer an option she could justify, and that doubt had shifted into resolve, quiet but firm. She had spoken softly, not expecting a response, just to break the silence, to remind herself that she was not completely alone in that moment, telling him to stay awake, to keep going, even though she did not know if he could hear her, even though she did not know if it would make any difference at all. And then, after what felt like hours there, had been a change, subtle but unmistakable, his breathing steadier, his presence stronger, as if whatever line he had been close to crossing had slowly moved further away. She had exhaled for what felt like the first time in a long while, her shoulders dropping slightly as the tension eased just enough to let her realize how exhausted she was, how far she had pushed herself without thinking. She had not expected anything in return, not gratitude, not explanation, not even acknowledgement, because that was never why she had done it. And yet, as she stood there now in the present, facing the silent display of power outside her home, she understood that what had happened inside those walls that night had not gone unnoticed, and whatever she had given in that quiet moment, it had been seen, remembered, and now, somehow, it was being returned in a way she could never have imagined. There had been a moment during the night when everything almost unraveled, a moment so brief, yet so sharp that it stayed with Hannah even now as she stood frozen on her porch, because she remembered how close she had come to losing control of the situation entirely. It had started when the man on her couch suddenly stirred more forcefully than before, his hand tightening slightly against the fabric beneath him, his breathing shifting in a way that made her pause, her instincts immediately alert. Unsure if this was a sign of recovery or something else entirely, she had leaned in cautiously, her voice low and steady as she told him he was safe, even though she was not completely sure that was true, and for a second, his eyes opened fully, locking onto hers with an intensity that made her chest tighten, because there was nothing weak in that gaze, nothing uncertain, only awareness, calculation, and something deeper that she could not quite define. It was in that instant that the first surge of fear hit her, not because he seemed dangerous in an obvious way, but because she realized he was not an ordinary man, and whatever life he belonged to was far removed from her own. Her mind had raced, questioning whether she had made a mistake bringing him here, whether she had unknowingly placed herself and her son in the middle of something far bigger than she could handle. And for a heartbeat, she had considered stepping away, putting distance between herself and him before things went any further. But then, just as quickly, that moment shifted when his grip loosened and his eyes closed again, the tension fading as if it had never been there, leaving her standing in silence with the echo of that encounter still lingering in her thoughts, a quiet warning she could not ignore. The second moment came later, even more unsettling, when she heard a car slow down outside her house, its engine low but unmistakable in the stillness of the night, and her entire body had gone rigid as she turned toward the window, her breath caught halfway as she wondered if someone had come looking for him, if the unknown world he belonged to had already found its way to her doorstep. She had moved carefully, keeping the lights dim, her steps silent as she peeked through the edge of the curtain, her heart pounding as she scanned the street, expecting to see figures stepping out, expecting something to happen, but instead the car remained there for several long seconds before continuing on, disappearing into the darkness as quietly as it had arrived. Even though nothing followed, even though no one knocked and no voices called out, the fear it left behind was enough to make her realize just how fragile her situation was, how quickly things could change, and how little control she truly had over what might come next. She had stayed awake longer after that, sitting in the chair across from the couch, watching him, listening to every small sound, every shift in the quiet, as if she could somehow prevent something from happening simply by being present. And yet, despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, she had not regretted her choice, not even then, because deep down there was still that same quiet certainty that had stopped her from walking away in the first place, the same instinct that told her she had done what was right, even if she did not yet understand the cost of it. Now, as she faced the line of men outside her home in the bright light of morning, those two moments returned to her with a clarity that made her realize something she had not fully grasped before, that the man she had helped was not just someone passing through her life. He was someone whose presence carried consequences, and those consequences had now arrived, standing silently in front of her, waiting for what would happen next. When the night finally gave way to early morning, the world inside Hannah's small house had grown quiet in a way that felt almost unreal, as if everything that had happened was slowly being folded away into something distant and unclear. She remembered sitting there in the dim light, her eyes heavy but unwilling to close, watching the steady rhythm of his breathing from across the room, measuring time not by the clock on the wall, but by each moment that passed without anything going wrong. At some point, exhaustion must have taken over, because she recalled her head lowering slightly, her thoughts fading just enough to blur the edges of her awareness. And when she opened her eyes again, the first thing she noticed was the silence, a different kind of silence, one that immediately told her something had changed. Her body straightened instantly, her gaze snapping toward the couch where he had been, only to find it empty. The blanket slightly shifted, the space still holding the faint impression of where he had been lying just moments before. Her heart skipped as she stood up quickly, scanning the room, half expecting him to still be there, to say something, to explain, but there was nothing, no sound, no movement, only the quiet stillness of her home returning to what it had always been. She moved through the house cautiously, checking the kitchen, the narrow hallway, even pausing outside her son's room to make sure everything was as it should be. And with each step, The realization grew stronger that he was gone, not in a rushed or chaotic way, but in a way that felt deliberate, controlled, as if he had left exactly when he intended to and not a second later. When she returned to the living room, her eyes caught something she had not noticed before, resting on the small table beside the couch. A simple object that did not belong to her, something that stood out not because of its size, but because of the quiet significance it seemed to carry. She approached slowly, her fingers hesitating for just a second before picking it up, turning it slightly in her hand, studying its details. Without fully understanding what it meant, only sensing that it was not something ordinary, not something that would be left behind by accident. There were no words, no note, no explanation, just that single item and the memory of his presence lingering in the room, and somehow that absence spoke louder than anything. He could have said. She had stood there for a long moment, unsure whether to feel relieved that the night had ended without further complication or unsettled by how easily he had disappeared, leaving behind more questions than answers. Part of her wanted to believe that was the end of it, that whatever connection had briefly crossed in her life had now passed, allowing her to return to the routine she understood, the routine she could manage. But another part of her knew it was not that. Simple, because nothing about the way he had left felt like an ending. It felt like a pause, like something unfinished waiting to continue. Now, standing on her porch with the morning unfolding in a way she could never have predicted, that quiet departure took on a new meaning, because she could see clearly that he had not vanished from her life. He had only stepped away long enough for something else to arrive in his place. Something far more visible, far more undeniable, in whatever message he had intended to leave behind that morning. It was no longer subtle. It was standing right in front of her, impossible to ignore, and it was only just beginning. Hannah's fingers tightened slightly around the small object he had left behind, the cool surface pressing against her palm, as if grounding her in a moment that still felt unreal. Because now, standing face to face with something far beyond her understanding, she could feel the connection between that quiet departure and the overwhelming presence in front of her. A connection that made her pulse quicken with a mix of confusion and anticipation. The men had not moved, not even an inch there. Formations still perfectly aligned, their attention unwavering, and the longer the silence stretched, the more it felt intentional, as if they were waiting for something specific, something that had not yet happened. She glanced briefly down the street again, noticing details she had missed at first, the way the vehicles were positioned with precision, the subtle coordination between them, the sense that every part of this scene had been planned long before she stepped outside. And that realization sent a quiet unease through her, because nothing about this was spontaneous. Nothing about this was accidental. A soft sound behind her pulled her attention back, the faint creak of the door as it shifted. Slightly, reminding her once again that her world was not just hers alone, that everything happening right now existed just a few steps away from the life she had worked so hard to protect, and that thought brought a new layer of tension to the moment, a protective instinct rising within her that made her stand a little straighter, even as uncertainty still lingered. She looked back at the men, searching for any sign of what would come next, and that was when she noticed it, a subtle movement. At the far end of the line, not abrupt, not disruptive, but enough to ripple through the stillness like a signal passing silently from one point to another. One of the car doors opened, slowly, deliberately, and even from where she stood, she could sense the shift in energy, the unspoken acknowledgement among the men that something important was about to happen. Her breath caught as her focus locked onto that single point. The rest of the scene fading slightly as anticipation took over her mind, racing through possibilities, each one more uncertain than the last, because deep down she already knew this was the moment everything would begin to make sense or become even more complicated. A figure stepped out, composed and steady, moving with a confidence that did not need to be announced, and even before she could fully see his face, before the distance between them closed enough for certainty, something inside her recognized him, not from familiarity in the usual sense, but from the memory of that quiet night, from the presence that had filled her living room without explanation. Her grip on the object tightened instinctively as the realization began to form, slow but undeniable, that the man she had helped, the man who had left without a word, was not just connected to what she was seeing now. He was at the center of it. The rows of men did not move, but the air itself seemed to shift as he walked forward, each step measured, each movement controlled, and with every inch. He came closer. The distance between her past 24 hours and her entire life before that began to collapse into a single moment. Hannah did not step back this time. Even as her heart pounded harder, even as uncertainty pressed against her thoughts, because something deeper held her in place, something that told her this was the answer she had been waiting for, even if she was not ready for what it meant. And as he finally reached the front of the formation, the silence around them deepened, not empty, but filled with expectation, as if the entire world had paused just long enough for him to speak and for her to understand exactly who she had chosen to save. As he stepped fully into view, the distance between memory and reality disappeared, and Hannah felt the weight of recognition settle over her with quiet certainty, because there was no mistaking the man now standing before her, no denying that he was the same one she had helped the night before. Yet everything about him had changed in a way that made her breath catch. He no longer looked like someone in need. There was no trace of weakness in the way he carried himself, no uncertainty in his posture, only a calm, controlled authority that seemed to command the entire street without a single word spoken. And it was in that contrast that the truth began to unfold in her mind, slow but undeniable. The men behind him remained perfectly still, their heads still lowered, their silence no longer unsettling but purposeful, as if their stillness itself was a statement, a reflection of the man who now stood at the center of it all. Hannah's grip tightened around the object in her hand as she watched him approach, each step deliberate, each movement measured, and with every second that passed, the realization grew clearer that this was not just someone important. This was someone powerful in a way she had never encountered before. He stopped a few feet away from her, close enough that she could see the same sharpness in his eyes that had unsettled her the night before. But now it was different. Now it was paired with something else, something steadier, something that felt almost like recognition. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence stretched between them. Not empty, but filled with everything that had happened and everything that had yet to be said. Then, without raising his voice, without any dramatic gesture, he spoke her name, Hannah, and the sound of it, spoken with quiet certainty, sent a ripple through her thoughts because she had never told him, not once, not during the long hours of that night. And yet he said it as if he had always known. Her heart skipped as she tried to process that detail, that small but undeniable proof that whatever world he belonged to operated on a level far beyond her own understanding. He continued, his voice steady, controlled, carrying just enough weight to hold her attention completely. You made a choice last night that most people would not have made. And there was no accusation in his tone, no judgment, only a calm acknowledgement that seemed to carry more meaning than the words themselves. Hannah opened her mouth slightly, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to respond to something that felt so much larger than her. But before she could speak, he shifted his gaze briefly toward the men behind him, and in that single motion, something changed. As if responding to an unspoken command, every one of them lowered themselves further, the gesture deepening, becoming more pronounced, transforming from a simple bow into something that felt like a declaration, a collective acknowledgement of the moment and of her place within it. The sight was overwhelming, not because of fear, but because of the sheer scale of it, the realization that all of this, every person, every movement, every carefully controlled detail was connected to the man standing in front of her, and somehow, to her as well. He turned his attention back to her, his expression unchanged, but his presence undeniable. And in that moment, without needing to explain further, without needing to reveal every detail of who he was, he made it clear that her life had already shifted, that the quiet decision she had made in the rain had crossed into something far greater than she could have imagined. And as she stood there, caught between the world she knew and the one now unfolding before her, Hannah understood that there was no going back to what her life had been before, because this moment, this encounter, was not the end of something unexpected. It was the beginning of something that would change everything. The silence after his words did not feel empty. It felt final, as if something invisible had just been decided without needing further explanation, and Hannah could feel it settling in a place around her, reshaping everything she thought she understood about her life. Her heart was still racing, but it was no longer just from confusion or fear. It was from the realization that this moment carried weight, real and lasting, something that would not fade once the cars left or the street returned to normal. She looked at him, really looked this time, noticing the details she had not allowed herself to see the night before, the composure in his expression, the quiet control in the way he stood, the kind of presence that did not demand attention but held it effortlessly. And she understood now why nothing about that night had felt ordinary, because he was not ordinary, not in any sense of the word. Her voice came slowly, careful, as if choosing the wrong words might somehow disrupt everything unfolding around her. "Who are you?" And even as she asked it, she realized the question was larger than it sounded, because it carried everything she did not yet understand, everything she was trying to piece together. He held her gaze for a brief moment, not avoiding the question, but not rushing to answer it either. And when he finally spoke, his tone remained calm, measured, as if the truth itself did not need to be dramatic to be powerful. "I am someone who does not forget what is owed." And while the words were simple, the meaning behind them was not, because it carried a promise, not just of gratitude, but of something far more significant. He glanced once more toward the men behind him, and this time the gesture was different, not a signal for movement, but a quiet acknowledgement of what they represented, of the reach and influence that stood silently waiting. And then he returned his attention to her, his focus steady, unwavering. "Last night, you gave help when you had no reason to, when it would have been easier to walk away," he continued, and there was a subtle shift in his voice now. Something more personal, something that made the distance between them feel smaller despite everything else. "People like you are rare," and that statement, simple as it was, landed heavier than she expected, because no one had ever described her that way before. Not in a life filled with struggle and quiet sacrifices that usually went unnoticed. Hannah swallowed, her thoughts racing as she tried to understand what this meant for her, for her son, for the fragile stability she had fought so hard to maintain. And before she could form another question, he spoke again, this time with a clarity that left no room for doubt. "From this moment on, you will not face this world alone." And the words settled over her like something solid, something real, not exaggerated or uncertain, but certain in a way that made her realize he was not offering a possibility. He was stating a fact. Behind him, the line of men remained still, their presence no longer intimidating in the same way, but instead reinforcing what he had just said, making it clear that this was not empty reassurance. It was backed by something tangible, something immediate. Hannah glanced back at her house for just a second, at the door that led to everything she had known, everything she had been trying to protect, and then back at him, standing in front of a future she had never imagined. And in that moment, she understood that her life had already shifted beyond the point of return, not because she had asked for it, not because she had planned it, but because of a single decision made in the quiet of a rainy night, a decision that had now brought her face to face with a world of power, protection, and unknown possibilities. And as the morning light grew brighter around them, it became clear that this was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of something far greater than she had ever allowed herself to believe could exist.